But it feels like 1933.
Hi, this is Arnie Arneson, and this is a continuation of the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arneson and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. We continue to record on Wednesday morning. Well, this is also race class. We are up to episode 20. Boy, thank you so much for doing this, Jonathan Feingold. Let me remind everyone of that one of the raison d'etres for race class was because legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country. In an effort to respond, BU law professor Jonathan Feingold and the Attitude's Arnie Arneson are offering race class. It's once a month. It's a course. It's a conversation where you can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history rather than fear and anxiety. And I really do think that this is like so important. And Jonathan, we had planned something else for episode 20. So explain to my audience what the original plan was, why we have to divert from that plan, but to a large extent, it's really a wonderful opportunity to talk about things that are happening today in the news, but to go back to what was the reason why we even decided to do race class, because it started almost 2 years ago, and yet it was sort of the response of the media, the response of the public, which really didn't, I think, quite comprehend what was happening, why it was happening, and how they needed to become informed. And so our response to that lack of knowledge was to offer race class.
Thanks, Arnie. As always, I'm delighted to be here with you. And as you mentioned, so our plan for today, for the essentially to have a special 20th episode was we were going to have a long conversation with Victor Ray, who's an incredible scholar at the University of Iowa and recently published a book called On Critical Race Theory. For scheduling reasons, we're not going to bring Professor Ray on today, but we will bring him back either later this summer or in the fall. And so we'll have that conversation. But given that he's not here, the question is, well, what do we talk about? And so my sense, like you just sort of foreshadowed, is we can sort of go back to the beginning. And like, Arnie, do you remember the first conversation we had, the first substantive conversation we had, that first episode that I guess was in January 2021, 2022? I don't know.
You have to refresh my recollection. I feel like there's been so much packed into my brain. But I knew that once I had interviewed you once, I think you had written a piece of the conversation. I remember reaching out to you going, you need to come on the air all the time. We need to teach about this. We need to talk about it, because I was so inspired by that original conversation. So refresh my recollection, please.
The first episode was all about framing. Yeah. It was all about how we characterize, situate, describe some incident or event. What we were talking about specifically was, so at that point, and I believe it was January 2020, we had already seen about a year of sort of this rise, this metastasizing campaign, essentially that had taken over the GOP, of discriminatory censorship. Yeah. There it was targeting teaching on structural racism, on critical race theory, on systemic racism. It had begun bleeding into don't say gay type bills that prohibited teachers from engaging issues of gender and sexuality. And the question we raised is, well, how is the media, the mainstream media, not the far left, whatever that is, or the far right, whatever that is, but like the New York Times, the Washington Post, how are they framing what we are experiencing? And what we sort of landed on was there had essentially been the adoption of some culture war frame, or is critical race theory okay frame, or even what is critical race theory frame. What we didn't have was free speech under assault frame. And one reason why we brought that up is because we, for at least the past decade, one of the most sort of pronounced themes that you see in these publications are all about some existential free speech crisis that often focuses on left-leaning students and they're protesting in colleges. And it's so easy anytime you get some student protest and then some administrator response for at least 17 New York Times op-eds to throw their hands up in the air about this existential free speech crisis we are facing. But when an entire political party's like governance style is openly and unapologetically discriminatory censorship, somehow the free speech frame disappears and the culture war frame appears. So that's where we were in January 2020. I published late last night with two colleagues an op-ed that was essentially trying to resurface, that concern about our broader free speech conversation in this country. And so I thought this would be a really nice opportunity to just walk through essentially the 5 main moves that we make in that op-ed.
And the title of the piece, it just dropped at Newsweek. I recommend it. I'll Facebook it. I tweeted it out this morning. I just want everyone to sort of focus on it. It is entitled at Newsweek, "The Real Threat to Free Speech is Coming from the Right." And as you pointed out, you wrote it with 2 other faculty members that you work with. And the timing couldn't be better. The timing couldn't be better because we've been talking a lot about what is happening in Florida with the Black History curriculum. We've been talking, and we're going to continue to talk about what's going on in Texas, where a Texas professor was temporarily removed because of her comments that she made about the lieutenant governor and a response to the opioid crisis. And so all of a sudden, we're seeing all these things happen, and they're having real consequences. One, when you're talking about a Black history curriculum for K through 12, you're talking about having a real impact on every educational opportunity in Florida. When you were talking about what's going on at Texas A&M, it is such a chilling statement to all the faculty, not just at Texas A&M, but every faculty member that teaches in Texas at a public institution. So again, I think it's really important, but isn't it ironic because it is thematic with Republican politicians. It is thematic with the MAGA crowd. And maybe because it's thematic, we don't look at it as a threat to free speech because it's another party and it's not an isolated incident.
So a couple things before we get into the substance of this op-ed. We really need to take seriously this question, why is it so hard for us as a country, for our arguably most important and impactful press outlets, why is it so hard for them to just simply describe the GOP's, again, open and unapologetic governance style, which is discriminatory censorship? That it is a feature. It is not a bug, and it's what people run on. And so just we need to ask the question, why is that so hard? Why is it so easy to mischaracterize protesting students as an existential threat to free speech, and yet so impossibly hard to say that, well, the GOP is running on a platform of silencing its opponents, and yet not describe that as actually an existential threat to free speech?
So let me just say something. I think I know what the boogeyman is. They say, see, the New York Times is being partisan. See, the Washington Post is being partisan. Well, wait a minute. If the party is being fascist, if the party is denying free speech, if the party is doing that, you're not being partisan. You're just pointing out how they're operating. It's an operating principle. It's not a partisan principle. It's what they're doing. And yet, because it's connected to what historically was, a Republican and Democratic Party, it isn't a Republican Party anymore. That's part of the problem is they're going a flashback to the Bush family. They're taking a flashback to even Reagan for that matter. But this is no longer any of those things. And therefore it isn't partisan. It is the facts and it is an operating tool. And you can't call it partisan. You have to call it what it is.
2 quick plugs, and then we will get into the meat of the piece. So for anyone who is intrigued, curious, interested, wants more, the African American Policy Forum's Critical Race Theory Summer School is arriving on July 30th through August 3rd. You can attend either in person live at Martha's Vineyard or virtually. I will be on a panel with an incredibly stellar set of folks on Monday evening at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Come to the Vineyard or Zoom in. And the other
we'll connect everyone on Facebook, so we'll make sure that you know how to make a connection if you so choose to. And the good news is you can drop in or drop out at will. So keep going.
So the 2 co-authors of this op-ed, really renowned academics, critical theorists, Athena Mutua at University of Buffalo School of Law and Angela Harris over at UC Davis. It was very much a collaborative process project that came out of the Critical Legal Collective, which is a sort of broad coalition of scholars, many legal academics, but not limited to them, who are taking steps to, again, resist this broad campaign of discriminatory censorship and attempt to figure out ways to make legal curriculum more vibrant by adding critical perspectives. Look it up, Critical Legal Collective, CLC. Okay, so we wrote an op-ed. Why write an op-ed? Really, it was not to litigate any particular incident, but rather it was to identify and interrupt what we see as very troubling dynamics that are defining our quote-unquote free speech debates. And these are dynamics that are rendering it harder for us to actually see what is going on. The first dynamic, and we've already alluded to this, is that as a country, we continue to misdiagnose the crisis. So there's this standard script. You've got students who speak or students who protest, then administrators respond or they don't. And then pundits, always on the right, sometimes on the left, often in the middle, they decry quote unquote cancel culture, free speech crisis on campus, as if the students are to blame, as if students somehow hold the power of the state, of the police, to silence, to cancel. Now, of course, there's a free speech crisis, but please stop blaming the students. The threat, as we've mentioned, is that we have a major political party who is governing on a platform of discriminatory censorship. The list goes on and on and on, whether it's hundreds of quote unquote anti-CRT or don't say gay bills, thousands upon thousands of book bans, defunding public libraries. The example you just mentioned of a Texas A&M faculty member who was offering her expert opinion on opioid policy, and then Texas's corrupt lieutenant governor essentially makes a phone call and says cancel, and the school administrator says, okay, we're going to do your bidding. The record could not be more clear. And yet we are in this moment where we've got these two things going on.
I think what's also important here is that, for example, we've been sort of looking at things like book banning, and it turns out it's 6 or 7 parents almost across all the book banning that are responsible for book banning. So it's not like something is bubbling up about banning books. It's that the book banners know exactly what they're doing. They don't need numbers. They need a connection to a party. They need a connection to power. They need a connection to a governor. So they then target a book. It's one parent, but all of a sudden the book disappears, not because anyone in the school really thinks it should be gone, but because what they have is the echo chamber in the commissioner of education, or the echo chamber in the governor's office. And as a result, it's because of that power at the top that they are, though, so empowered at the bottom, but they are an individual of one. And it turns out that it was one person who somehow or other was offended by what this professor at Texas A&M said and interpreted it in a way that only she interpreted. But it turns out, Jonathan, her mother is very close to the lieutenant governor. So as soon as she heard an anecdote with the name of the governor, she automatically knee-jerked assumed that it was critical, which nobody else in the class even heard or understood it to be. And that's how this happened. It happened because of one student, but that one student had what? Connection to power. And as you point out, it's not a bug, it's a feature. And what they want to do is they want to chill speech.
And it is about power. It's about chilling speech. It is about silencing any dissent. And it is about weaponizing the political infrastructure to do so. And something I think it's worth noting that the critical race theorists warned a couple years ago that the attacks on critical race theory were not going to stop with critical race theory. It was a Trojan horse to entrench the most cynical form of political power, to silence all opposing viewpoints. Opioid stuff, obviously there's racialized dimensions to it, but that was not about critical race theory. That was just someone who was criticizing it seemingly obliquely, the lieutenant governor, acting like this quote unquote snowflake that we've heard so much about. First thing that we meant to highlight was that we continue to misdiagnose the crisis. And I get it. that students oftentimes are contesting the bounds of what is appropriate or permissible speech in the classroom. Like, let's have those conversations. You disagree, but we have to be very clear about where the threat to free speech is coming from. It's not coming from the students. Second big thing, you often hear, I don't know, Arnie, tell me if you've ever heard this before, that universities should, quote unquote, be neutral, that they shouldn't take sides. Ever hear that?
All the time. All the time. Yes, I do hear that.
So we hear that all the time. And it's, you know, you could think of it almost like the states' rights move. It's an attempt to sort of abstract out to offer some neutral proposition such that a university is not permitted to say that, for instance, anti-racism is better than racism or equity is better than inequality. Now, the thing is, there's some truth to it. Now, when universities regulate speech, generally, you're not permitted to silence disfavored viewpoints. As a regulator, when you essentially are hosting different speakers on your campus. But universities are also speakers. And in this role, they have a mandate to teach, research, and pursue truth for the common good. All of that requires taking sides. Now, imagine a science department and some speaker comes in denying any relationship between human beings and the rise in global temperature. You would not expect that department to stay silent. Of course, they would counter that viewpoint. Nor would you expect a Jewish studies department to stay silent when some speaker comes in saying, no, the Holocaust never happened, made up, fake news. Would they stay silent? Of course not. And I'll just quote First Amendment scholar Stephen Calabresi. He puts it pretty simply. Universities could not even function if they did not choose to praise some viewpoints and criticize others. The whole point of education is being able to distinguish between good ideas and bad ideas. Now, that means that when your community, your students are under attack, verbally or otherwise, it is incumbent upon universities to use their voice to counter those viewpoints.
So let me stop you, because you mentioned, the Holocaust denial, that there was never a Holocaust. Am I praising the fact that there was, in fact, factually a Holocaust? Is that the right word? I'm not praising something. I am saying this is factually inaccurate. There is no evidence to this. This is a lie. This is made up of whole cloth. This is not a praise that because, yes, there are in fact facts to show that there was a Holocaust. I almost feel uncomfortable about the term praising, because I don't praise things that are so clearly factual. And what the person is doing is basically saying, don't believe your eyes, don't believe your ears, don't believe your mouth, don't believe these things. And I'm sorry, that's just not acceptable. And I guess my uncomfortableness is with the idea that I'm praising something when I think it goes so far beyond that, Jonathan.
So that example, that hypothetical, is just meant to illuminate what we often don't see, but that obviously universities have to take sides. You cannot function if your mode of engagement is, well, here's one perspective, here's another perspective. You all choose, we're opting out. Like, that's actually abdicating your responsibility as a university to teach. The other thing is that, like, all those folks, whether it's the DeSantis's of the world, the Rufos of the world, who are constantly shouting, like literally just like tossing words out like wokeness, indoctrination. Like, they know that there's no such thing as a neutral university. What they want is a university with particular values that are not connected to sort of modern commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion, but those from an era in which most Americans had no seat at the table. It's not about taking values out of the university. It's about putting different values in. Third main point, what I would think of as sort of selective indifference. And so this is really about the pretty common refrain that you hear now, that conservative students have to navigate an unfriendly campus climate. you hear like that is a, you know, leading talking point in the broad campus sort of free speech discourse. Now, I want to be super clear that I view the classroom as a pretty sacred place. Really, like it is one of those rare places where the commitment is to each other and to learning and to just mutual progress and development. And everyone, like whatever your prior, should feel welcome and valued. But I've long been deeply troubled by the ease with which so many people center and privilege the feelings of conservative students after literally decades in which even the mainstream press belittled similar sorts of concerns from students of color or LGBTQ people.
Right.
And like the thing is, like, this is like, I'm not trying to invite some false equivalence. Conservative students, to whatever extent they are sort of confronting
Attacks?
some unfriendly environment,
Yeah.
they're not encountering a presumption of intellectual incompetence like students of
Yes.
color are always facing. They're not confronting some denial of their very identities, which is essentially what the anti-LGBTQ campaigns are all about right now. And many of these same folks are still mocking quote unquote microaggressions or ridiculing students who are simply protesting racist speech as, again, quote unquote oversensitive snowflakes. But we should be very clear that the claim that conservative students face an unfriendly campus climate employs effectively the same logic as microaggressions. You are linking your sort of personal claims to numerical underrepresentation, to perceived verbal slights, and to a sense that your peers, your professors are biased against you. And I think the only other important thing to say is that, like, another side of this free speech debate is that, well, feelings don't matter. Stop being oversensitive. You have to work through the discomfort, students. But those sorts of claims, like, those are almost always limited to students of color. Like,
yes.
You
There
don't
you go.
hear
That's
that
exactly
same
right.
that same admonition when it comes to the conservative student. You don't hear, yeah, just like, like thicken up. You got to
But
deal
that's
with
the Texas A&M story. That's the Texas A&M story. It's exactly that. I mean, again, it's you're supposed to handle it. You're supposed to be able to deal with it, except if you're a conservative student. And then all of a sudden, it's like my story about the banning of books. One parent. What happened to them thickening up? What about them, handling it? Apparently, they don't have to, but the rest of us do. Jonathan.
I mean, you had a party whose tagline was "F your feelings,"
Yes.
and too many bought in that. Oh, like this is like. There's so many examples that reveal a double standard that mean either, just sort of ignorance of self-contradiction and hypocrisy, or that it was just a talking point, that it was not actually meant to be earnest, that it was F your feelings, but protect mine. We only have like 70 seconds left. And so we're not going to get through everything. So if you're interested, you got to read the op-ed. But I'm going to say one final thing in the last 15 seconds I have. I'm also uncomfortable at the sort of constant way in which I see often professors, among others, really infantilize students, either just caricature students as intolerant children or constantly admonish students for protesting the wrong way. I'm not suggesting that I agree with how students are protesting all the time. I think oftentimes just ignoring is better than protest, because protesting can, quote unquote, feed the trolls. Don't want to feed the trolls. But if we really believe in persuasion over coercion, like, it's incumbent that we actually persuade our students and not scold them. And if we're not able to persuade them, then we should look inside and not blame students for really just demanding the world they deserve. They get far better than we do often that they're facing existential crises on multiple fronts.
And time is of the essence for them, as well as time is of the essence for us. Jonathan Feingold, this is episode 20. This is Race Class. we kind of went off a little bit the norm because you had a piece that just dropped in Newsweek. It is entitled, "The Real Threat to Free Speech is Coming from the Right." Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Feingold. I really appreciate it. And these are the conversations we have to have over and over again because they make us think. Thank you again. This is the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. We will schmooze tomorrow, everyone. Ciao.
You better